Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Bonnie Lowenthal. I represent the greater Long Beach area, and I'm proud to be the chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus. We're here today, all of us, and you can see the people in back of me, the students. We're here to bring light to the far-reaching crisis of sexual assaults on our campuses. Nationally, sexual assault on campus remains the most drastically underreported crime. 10 times more rapes are reported to crisis lines than are reported to police. But nearly half of the women who are raped tell no one, leaving them without support services of any kind. We need to change the way we look at sexual assault and how we talk about it. Frankly, it comes down to consent. Consent must be honored by both individuals. We have to change our thinking and discredit untruths surrounding this issue. Let's talk about the facts. 90% of women know the person who sexually assaulted or raped them. 90%. Nearly 3/4 of rapes were planned in advance. 3/4. And women who are raped do physically resist. Unfortunately, many women do not consider what happened to them to be rape, and they blame themselves. It goes far beyond the physical and emotional damage. College students who have been victims of sexual assault suffer from a host of problems that impede not only their academic achievement, but their entire lives. It's been a long time coming, but we're starting to see a shift in response to campus sexual assaults, not just here in California, but in the national stage as well. President Obama has issued a presidential memorandum establishing the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault. The task force will be charged with sharing best practices and increasing transparency, enforcement, public awareness, and interagency coordination to prevent violence and support survivors. At his side was Vice President Joe Biden, who said, quote, "Our daughters, our sisters, our wives, our mothers, our grandmothers have every single right to expect to be free from violence and sexual abuse. No matter what she's wearing, no matter whether she's in a bar, a dormitory, in the back seat of a car, on a street, drunk or sober, no man has a right to go beyond the word no. And if she can't consent, it also means no." Those of us up here couldn't agree more. California cannot expect our students to get an education while also dealing with the fear, the trauma, and disadvantage related to sexual assault. California deserves better. Our students deserve better. It's time for our college campuses to step up to the plate and join us in the fight to end sexual assault. I'd now like to introduce the vice chair to the Women's Caucus and a partner in this effort, Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson. I am the vice chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus and a joint author with Senator Kevin De León of this legislation. For far too long, there's been a trivializing attitude about rape that ignores the victim and protects the perpetrator. It seems sexual assault is treated as an inevitable part of the college experience, and instead of fighting to change it, schools simply overlook it. This issue is very important to me and to the young women who are standing behind me today, as well as those our author and the members of the Legislative Women's Caucus, and probably most people here in this building. But back in 2002, some 12 years ago, while I was in the State Assembly, Governor Davis signed a bill I authored, which requires the state auditor to review colleges and universities' compliance with the Jean Cleary Act. Now, the Clery Act requires U.S. colleges and universities to disclose information about the crime on and around their campuses and to disclose their security policies. This law stemmed from the rape and murder of Jean Clery on her university's campus many years ago. These audits have shown that a number of schools do comply with the Clery Act and they follow the law with due diligence. However, as we've heard from victims throughout the state and nationally, we are simply not doing enough. There are stories of student sex offenders who are given no more than a slight warning or a slap on the wrist by universities. We hear stories of sexual misconduct cases at universities that are never pursued. Colleges and universities have processes that protect and favor the perpetrators or humiliate the victims, and stories of victims so discouraged by the system that they simply don't see any point in coming forward and reporting what's happened to them. We believe that schools have an affirmative duty to educate their students and protect their communities from this behavior. And as Bonnie reminds us, rape is an underreported crime. In fact, fewer than 5% of attempted and completed rapes of women in college were reported to law enforcement officers. Less than 5%. College-age victims often feel powerless over their victimization, and they feel restricted by lack of proof, by fear of reprisal by the assailant, or a fear of simply not being taken seriously by the police or school officials, and with good cause. These rape victims, however, suffer the same psychological harms as stranger rape victims. But college acquaintance rape victims actually face additional consequences. Many drop out of school because if they stay, they might regularly face their attackers in class, in their dorms, or at campus events. While we're here to change that paradigm, we are going to change that thinking of inaction. We are going to make a strong statement through this legislation that California is moving from a culture of acceptance to a culture of no excuses. No excuses for rape, no excuses for blaming the victim, no excuses for not supporting the victims, and no excuses for colleges and universities turning a blind eye to this kind of sexual behavior. I'm extremely hopeful that this year, with the leadership of the Women's Caucus, the wonderful young women standing behind us in support today, and of our next President Pro Tem of the Senate, we can transform the culture on California's campuses and make them safe environments for our women and all our students. And now I want to introduce a young feminist, a student who is fighting for women's rights to be safe on her college campus, Sarah Yang.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. And thank you, Senator León, for authoring this legislation and for addressing sexual assault on college campuses. My name is Sarah Yang, and I'm currently a senior and the co-president of the Women's Health Initiative at UC Davis. Today, I am here as an individual devoted to women's health, sexual violence prevention, and campus education. In 2011, I co-founded the Women's Health Initiative in order to serve and inform the local community on women's health-related issues. We also wanted to offer support to women who are victims of sexual assault and violence. Since 2011, the Women's Health Initiative has forged partnerships in Yolo County clinics to provide sex education to high schools, as well as coordinated drives and fundraisers for the Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Center in Woodland. One of my greatest personal stories I can share with you is witnessing 150 male college students march in support of our crusade against sexual assault last year. And actually, I have a tank top, which we made, which says, it's a creative slogan that we made that all the men wore that says, "I mustache for consent." And so this is kind of like a big hit on our campus. We are in the process of coordinating another men's march against sexual assault this spring. And so I'm honored here today to support the legislation presented by Senator León and the leadership of the Legislative Women's Caucus. As a student, I see the need to change the culture on college campuses surrounding sexual violence. Although we have assessed that sexual assault is unacceptable, there is so much more work that needs to be done. I believe that each school should be equipped to provide resources for student survivors. Personally, I didn't know that my campus had a prevention center until my 3rd year. If students don't know that a campus violence prevention program exists, then they would not know where to turn if they experience sexual assault. The more policies, procedures, and resources that we dedicate to this cause, the more we can change the campus stigmas surrounding sexual violence. In the name of prevention, these steps are absolutely necessary for campuses to be a safe learning space for all students. I would like to thank Senator León for his leadership on this issue. It is gratifying to see larger entities at work supporting sexual violence prevention, and also very humbling to know that my community service work has a role in making campuses safer. With this legislation, California could lead the way in a national movement to end sexual violence on college campuses. Thank you for your time.
Well, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kevin. For those who don't know me, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with each and every one of you. First, I want to thank Sarah for her very articulate remarks. Thank you very much, Sarah, for coming up today. Let's give her a hand, please. I also wanted to thank the Women's Legislative Caucus, specifically our chair, as well as our vice chair, Assemblywoman Bonnie Lowenthal, as well as our vice chair, Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson. Let's give it up, please. Sexual assaults and rapes are crimes of violence, and they need to be understood and treated as such. Men, young men, teenage boys need to understand the seriousness of these crimes, and we need a cultural shift to take these crimes much more seriously. Sexual assaults are just too common, and we need to fundamentally change that. We have a culture that actually stigmatizes survivors, and let me emphasize and underscore, or I should say overscore, that we have a culture that stigmatizes survivors, and not the perpetrators. That needs to change. Men need to change their behavior because by far and large, men, young men, teenage boys are the perpetrators of these sexually violent crimes on campus. This isn't about boys being boys. This is about men, young men, teenage boys being sexual predators. There's nothing casual about this. Being intoxicated is not an excuse. It's not okay to take advantage of a woman without consent. As a father of a sophomore in college, I'm deeply concerned that schools are simply not doing enough to protect students from these very violent crimes. When sexual assaults happen, we need to have campus support systems that don't victimize survivors a second time. There's little uniformity across or even within institutions throughout the state of California. Too much is left to circumstance, and all too commonly, offenders do not face any serious penalties for their crimes. Schools must be held accountable, and rapes simply cannot be swept under the rug. SB 967, a measure that I will be introducing with my joint author to my left, Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson, as well as my principal co-author, the chair of the Women's Legislative Caucus, Assemblywoman Hannah-Beth Jackson. Bonnie Lowenthal.
That's the Assembly. It's okay.
Hannah-Beth Jackson, Bonnie Lowenthal from the LBC and from Santa Barbara Central Coast right here. My partners in this endeavor will require California colleges as well as universities to address college sexual violence by requiring them to adopt victim-centered sexual assault response policies and protocols that follow best practices as well as professional standards. The measure will change the equation so the system is not stacked against the survivors. And it will make very clear that no means no. There's no ambiguity, there's no vagueness to this question. And only yes means yes within an affirmative consent policy. There's nothing that's vague, there's nothing that's ambiguous to this equation right here. Survivors need justice, and we need to support them. I'm going to share a few words in Spanish for the media. Do we have any media in Spanish? We do. Univision, ¿verdad? Ah, sí, sí. Bueno. Bienvenida, Marta. Las agresiones sexuales y violaciones son crímenes de violencia y necesitan ser comprendidos y tratados como tales. Vivimos en una sociedad que estigmatiza a los sobrevivientes y no a los asaltantes. Eso tiene que cambiar sin lugar a dudas. Los hombres tienen que cambiar su comportamiento porque por lo general son los que cometen los delitos de violencia sexual en contra de las mujeres. Eso no tiene nada que ver con ser hombre. Simplemente el mayor número de los hombres, el mayor número de los crímenes violentos son cometidos por hombres. Nunca, pero déjame enfatizar y subrayar, nunca está bien aprovecharse de una mujer sin su consentimiento. La medida mía con mis colegas del Senado, la senadora Hannah-Beth Jackson y también mi colega a la mano derecha, la asambleísta de Long Beach, Bonnie Lowenthal, la medida nuestra cambiará los protocolos y las políticas en las universidades para no estar en contra, déjame enfatizar y subrayar, no estar en contra de los sobrevivientes. Los sobrevivientes necesitan y merecen justicia y tenemos que apoyarlas, nada más y nada menos. Como padre de una hija en el segundo año en el colegio, los hombres tenemos que colectivamente alzar nuestras voces en defensa de estas jóvenes, porque sin lugar a dudas, y déjeme recalcar, el mayor número de los crímenes son cometidos no por las mujeres, pero sino por los hombres. Así que el papel nuestro es un papel muy importante, alzando nuestra voz colectivamente en defensa y autodefensa para las mujeres cuando se trata de crímenes sexuales en las universidades. With that, that is our press conference. We do have with us Sandra Enriquez, the Executive Director of CalCASA, that's the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. That's available for any questions. Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson, as well as our chair of the Women's Legislative Caucus, Bonnie Lowenthal. Happy to take any questions that you may have of the legislation, of the young women who have come out in strong solidarity in support of this policy. The question is, what is this measure going to do specifically? What we're looking for right now, yo te contesto en español también. What we're looking for is to set up a minimum standards of protocols on all the college campuses. The reality is that from a public university, whether it's UCLA, whether it's UC Berkeley, UC Irvine, and let me note that UC Irvine has probably one of the best protocols in the state of California, whether it's a private institution, Occidental College, which has been at the center of this news, which is in my backyard. I live 5 minutes away from Occidental College in my district. Whether it's a Pitzer College, whether it's a Cal State school. The reality is none of these campuses have a uniform policy as it relates to sexual assaults. They have a ad hoc in some instances. We have some good actors. One other one is Humboldt. Cal State Humboldt is another actor who is actually viewed as a campus that has a great protocol. Nonetheless, a lot of these campuses don't have that. We have scandals that have taken place at UCLA, at UC Berkeley, Occidental College, at the University of Southern California. One, we want to take best practices from community-based organizations that may be on campus or community-based campuses that may be off campus. For example, University of California at Santa Barbara, Westmount College, which is in Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson's area, we have the Santa Barbara Rape Crisis Center. Do they have a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, where they can work with organizations that already are dedicated and focus on sexual assaults and whether it's a verbal sexual harassment of some sort, it goes to the extreme of an actual sexual violent crime such as rape. So we want to set up minimum standards of protocols for all our college campuses throughout the state of California. Ahorita, uno, no sé. Yes, sir. MP. It's all under discussion right now. So stalking is part of it. Stalking is a sexual assault of some sort. When we talk about sexual assault, it's a very broad category. It can be from sexual assault. It can be from harassment. It can be a verbal type of a harassment, all the way to the extreme, which is a sexually violent crime, such as a rape. I think the most important thing is to make sure that young women have an opportunity to have a very productive college career, that they can focus on growing, developing, that they can focus on their academics, that they can focus on extracurricular activities. It's just a promise of going on to higher education and growing as an individual. You don't want, in this case, obviously, men in particular, to thwart that process. And the reality is it does happen. Assemblywoman Bonnie Lowenthal just articulated 1 out of 5 women have been assaulted on college campuses. We want to make sure that the administrators of these universities and private independent colleges are, in fact, have protocols that are in place, that are very clear, that are very transparent, that they create an environment that's conducive to all individuals, male and female, but especially in this case for female students. The reality is we have some college campuses that when they have freshman orientation, they really drive the point that no is no. It's just that simple. There is no excuse to be at a frat party or any party of any kind. It doesn't make a difference. If someone is inebriated, no is no, period. That's the law. But the reality is that we know this occurs often, much too often on college campuses. So we want to set those protocols. And I don't know if any of my colleagues want to add to that right there.
I think that in addition to the recognition of the degree of the problem, which has been so underreported, simultaneously there will be far more student services on campus because of Covered California. And so the mental health services that are needed by students who have had this dreadful experience, as the bill that these senators are carrying, that I'm principal co-author of, moves forward with a standardization. My hope is that the services available to students on campuses will be increased such that they are a lot more likely to make use of them.
And I just want to add that what we're hoping to do is shift the focus here. Colleges and universities have sort of traditionally, many of them, taken a sort of a noblesse oblige approach, out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to hear about it. This is just boys being boys, and all the different excuses for not taking any kind of responsibility for this behavior that we know is very prevalent on many college campuses. We also want the message to be loud and clear that men are going to have to take responsibility for their behavior. This is not an issue that is a woman's problem. This is a man's problem. If you behave in a way that is criminal, you are going to have to accept the consequences of this. It's sort of the notion that we don't just blame the victim. In fact, we're not going to blame the victim. We're going to put the responsibility and the onus on the perpetrator, and part of the way we're going to do that is through education. If the universities and the colleges start taking some responsibility for this behavior that goes on their campuses, and under the Clery Act have to report it, so that if you're looking at a school for yourself or one of your children, and you note that there have been a high incidence of this kind of sexual behavior going on, you may not be so inclined to send your children there. That's actually one of the reasons that I did the bill back in 2002. My daughter at that point in time, we were looking at colleges. I wanted to know what were the safer schools. So if we can't do this one way, we're going to do it the other way. It isn't a question of necessarily shaming the colleges and universities, but it is a message loud and clear that they are going to have to take responsibility for educating their students, for educating young men in particular, that this behavior is not going to be accepted on campus, and certainly our young women are going to get those services that they need should this happen. It's an educational process. It's one that, as Senator De León said, is going to require transparency and honesty, and hopefully will change that dynamic and shift the paradigm from where it has been far too long.
Have you had any input, or do you anticipate any input from some of the universities that you're speaking of, and particularly those who don't have the good protocols that others do have?
As of yet, we haven't had the input because we're just introducing the measure itself, but we're looking forward to the input from all the college administrators throughout the state of California. I know that the women's, and I'm sure that both Bonnie and Hannah-Beth can speak to this much better than me. My understanding is that the Women's Legislative Caucus will also be holding a series of hearings throughout the state of California. It's important to get the feedback from administrators, from rape crisis counseling centers, from Caucus, from college campuses that do have the best practices. I did note that 2 college campuses, Humboldt State as well as UC Irvine, are perceived to have very transparent and solid protocols as it relates to sexual assaults on campuses. Hearing from young women themselves, from the young students who are behind us and other young women throughout college campuses, hearing from young men is also important too. So we plan on getting the input from all the stakeholders, so again we can develop the best practices that help formulate the content of this measure as it moves forward. But a couple things is we're seeking, I'm sure we will receive the full cooperation of administrators throughout the college campuses. But if we have some bad actors that are out there, and there are some folks that are bad actors out there who like to sweep sexual assaults under the rug because perhaps it gives them a negative perception that a parent will not send their child to that campus. I love the fact that Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson, did her homework, and she wanted to make sure that the environment she sent her daughter off to was in fact a very safe environment, an environment that's supportive. The reality is colleges make lots of money themselves too, and no one's going to send their child to an environment that has a high number of sexual assaults that are either underreported or not reported at all. So this is a very serious issue. No one's trying to get anyone. This is not about gotcha. This is about creating a safe environment that's conducive to the learning and empowering of young women as well as young men. Sure, do you want me to come? Sure, let's come on inside.
Hi, good morning. One of the things that's really important about this legislation, and a key point to this legislation, is also that it calls for a comprehensive approach to prevention on campuses. So let's do what we can to prevent this from happening before it does. And when we talk about comprehensive, we're talking about a range of prevention. So we're talking about changing the attitudes of the perpetrators or the potential perpetrators, changing those attitudes where they're no longer acceptable, where that's not the norm. We're also talking about getting people to intervene, what we call bystander intervention, to get other people to come forward and interrupt behaviors or attitudes that foster sexual violence. But we're also talking about risk reduction, what we mean in terms of providing the females with the skills for them to be able to recognize, identify behaviors that are unacceptable, to speak out, to assert themselves, to communicate, and to do what they need to do. So when we look at it, we need to look at those 3 things where we don't exclude the potential victims from the formula, where they too are given the tools necessary to protect themselves when needed, but certainly recognizing that the responsibility doesn't lie on the potential victims, but it lies on the potential perpetrator. So that's a really key, important thing about this legislation as well. Thank you.
Madam Chair, do you want to close?
Is there a specific protocol you're putting forward with the legislation, or is that going to be developed later on?
That will be developed as we move forward, but you will know about it.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Press conference over.